October 30, 6:47 p.m. Overcast. The autumn wind carried more than just the scent of dying leaves through the streets of Millbrook Falls. That Halloween evening, it carried whispers of something darker, something that would tear through the fabric of this small Oregon town like a blade through silk. The sky hung low and gray, pregnant with the promise of rain, while jack-o'-lanterns flickered their final defiant grins before the storm. 12-year-old Zeke Thorne adjusted his homemade vampire cape one last time before stepping off the front porch of 1247 Maple Street. The cape, sewn by his mother Cordelia's loving but inexpert hands, dragged slightly on the wet pavement. His plastic fangs made him lisp when he spoke, but he wore them proudly after all. This might be his last year trick-or-treating. Next year, he'd be 13, practically a teenager. "Be back by 8:30, honey," Cordelia called from the doorway, her voice carrying that particular mixture of concern and forced cheerfulness that mothers perfect over years of practice. She watched her son's slight frame disappear into the growing dusk, his red hair catching the last rays of daylight like copper wire, and stay with Marcus. Zeke waved without turning around, already focused on the night's adventure ahead. He was meeting his best friend Marcus Holloway at the corner of Elm and 3rd. Just like they'd planned, Marcus, dressed as a werewolf, had been boasting all week about his older brother's inside knowledge of which houses gave out full-size candy bars. What Cordelia didn't know, what she would replay in her mind 10,000 times in the years to come, was that her son had already decided this would be his last stop at home that night. The boys had hatched a plan to venture beyond their usual neighborhood boundaries into the older part of town where the houses sat farther apart and the streetlights grew sparse. It was the kind of rebellion that felt monumental at 12, but would seem laughably innocent to any adult. The Thorne house sat in the heart of Millbrook Falls' newest development, where identical two-story colonials lined streets with names like Harmony Lane and Prosperity Drive. It was the kind of place where Halloween was a community event, where neighbors knew each other's children and the biggest crime was jaywalking. Cordelia and her husband Brighton had moved there specifically for the safety it promised, a cocoon of suburban normalcy wrapped around their most precious possession. Brighton Thorne was working late again that night, something that had become increasingly common since his promotion to senior accountant at Morrison & Associates. He'd promised to be home by 7 to see Zeke in his costume, but the office had other plans. As he sat in his ergonomic chair, bathed in the blue glow of his computer screen, he had no idea that his son was walking into a mystery that would consume the rest of their lives. At exactly 7:15 p.m., Zeke met Marcus at their designated corner. The streetlight there had been flickering for weeks, casting intermittent shadows that danced across the sidewalk like restless spirits. Marcus was already there, his werewolf mask pushed up on his forehead, revealing a gap-toothed grin. "You ready for this?" Marcus asked, hefting his pillowcase with theatrical importance. "Tommy says the house on Blackwood Avenue gives out $20 bills instead of candy." "That's stupid," Zeke replied, but his eyes lit up with possibility. "Nobody does that. Tommy swears it's true. Says old Mr. Van Court is loaded and weird enough to do it." The boys set off into the maze of suburban streets, their footsteps echoing off the wet asphalt. Other trick-or-treaters moved in small groups around them, pirates and princesses, superheroes and monsters, all following the unspoken rules of Halloween navigation. Parents hovered at safe distances, their phone flashlights creating small pools of security in the gathering darkness. For the first hour, everything proceeded according to plan. The boys worked their way through the friendly neighborhoods, accumulating a respectable haul of candy while keeping up a steady stream of 12-year-old bravado about venturing into the scary part of town. They passed the Miller house with its elaborate haunted graveyard display, dodged the motion-activated skeleton that jumped out at passers-by near the Johnsons' front door, and even managed to cadge an extra handful of Snickers from Mrs. Patterson, who remembered Zeke from her Sunday school class. It was at 8:23 p.m. that their paths diverged from the ordinary. They had reached the edge of their familiar territory, where Maple Street dead-ended into the old highway that bisected Millbrook Falls. Beyond the highway lay the original town, a cluster of Victorian houses and century-old buildings that predated the suburban development by decades. This was where the town's founding families had built their homes, where generations of history lay buried beneath layers of paint and renovations. "We should probably head back," Zeke said, checking the cheap digital watch his father had given him for his birthday. Mom said 8:30. "Come on," Marcus pleaded. "We are so close. Just one street. Blackwood Avenue is right there." He pointed across the highway to where a weathered street sign was barely visible in the gloom. Zeke hesitated. The rational part of his mind, the part that sounded disturbingly like his mother, urged him to turn around. But the part that was tired of being treated like a child, the part that yearned for just one taste of real adventure, won out. "Fine," he said, "but just one street, and then we go straight home." They crossed the highway with the exaggerated caution of children who know they are pushing boundaries. The asphalt was slick with the promise of rain, and their footsteps seemed louder in the relative quiet of the older neighborhood. Here the houses sat back from the road behind mature trees and wrought iron fences. Jack-o'-lanterns were fewer and farther between, their candlelight creating islands of warmth in the growing darkness. Blackwood Avenue stretched before them like something from a Gothic novel. The streetlights were older here, casting yellowish pools of illumination that seemed to emphasize rather than dispel the shadows. Victorian mansions loomed behind gardens gone wild with autumn decay, their gabled roofs and wraparound porches speaking of a more elegant but somehow more sinister time. "This place is creepy," Zeke whispered, pulling his vampire cape tighter around his shoulders. "That's the point," Marcus replied, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Look, there's 8047. That's got to be the Van Court place." The house at 1847 Blackwood Avenue stood apart from its neighbors, not just physically but atmospherically, where the other Victorian homes showed signs of care and habitation. Fresh paint, manicured lawns, porch lights burning bright. This one seemed to exist in its own pocket of perpetual twilight. The wraparound porch sagged under the weight of what looked like decades of neglect, and the windows were dark except for a single candle flickering in what might have been the front parlor. "Maybe he's not home," Zeke suggested hopefully. "The candle's lit," Marcus pointed out. "Besides, Tommy said he's always home. Never leaves the house." They approached the front gate with the cautious steps of explorers entering hostile territory. The wrought iron fence was elaborate but rusted, decorated with what might have been roses, but now looked more like thorns. The gate stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for visitors. The front walkway was cracked and uneven, lined with overgrown hedges that rustled with sounds that might have been wind or might have been something else entirely. As they climbed the 3 steps to the front porch, the old wood creaked ominously under their feet. "I don't see a doorbell," Marcus whispered. "There," Zeke pointed to an old-fashioned brass knocker shaped like a raven's head. "Use that." Marcus reached out, then hesitated. "You do it. This was your idea." "It was not my idea. You are the one." The front door opened. Neither boy had touched the knocker. Neither had called out or announced their presence beyond their whispered argument. The door simply opened, revealing a man who seemed to have stepped out of a different century entirely. Eldridge Van Court was tall and gaunt, with silver hair that fell to his shoulders and eyes the color of winter storms. He wore a black suit that might have been fashionable in the 1920s, complete with a vest and pocket watch. His skin was pale as parchment, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, and when he smiled, his teeth were too white and too perfect for a man who appeared to be in his 70s. "Good evening, young gentleman," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone who had learned to speak when proper diction still mattered. "I was wondering when you might arrive." The boys exchanged glances. There was something unsettling about the statement, something that suggested this meeting had been expected rather than coincidental. "Trick or treat?" Marcus managed, holding up his pillowcase with false bravado. "Ah, yes, the ancient ritual. Van Court's smile widened, revealing more of those unsettling teeth. "Please come in. I have something special prepared." Every instinct Zeke possessed screamed at him to run. The rational part of his mind. The part that sounded like his parents, like his teachers, like every adult who had ever warned him about strangers, was practically shrieking. But there was something else. Something that felt like invisible fingers pulling him forward, making his feet move against his will. The interior of the house was like stepping into a museum dedicated to a more elegant but darker age. Heavy velvet drapes blocked out the night, while candles provided the only illumination. The air smelled of old wood, leather bindings, and something else, something sweet and cloying that made Zeke's stomach turn. "Wait here," Van Court said, gesturing to an ornate sitting room filled with antique furniture. "I will fetch your treats." He disappeared through a doorway, leaving the boys alone in the candlelit room. Zeke noticed that the flames didn't flicker, despite the drafts that seemed to move constantly through the old house. They burned straight and steady, like tiny pillars of orange light. "We should go," he whispered to Marcus. "In a second," Marcus replied, but he was staring at something on the mantelpiece. "Look at this." Zeke followed his friend's gaze to where an ornate photograph sat, among various curiosities. The image showed a group of children, perhaps a dozen of them, dressed in old-fashioned clothing. But there was something wrong with their faces, something that made Zeke's skin crawl, even though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "How old do you think that picture is?" Marcus asked. Before Zeke could answer, Van Court returned carrying an ornate silver tray. On it sat two small packages wrapped in what looked like silk, tied with black ribbon. "For you," he said, offering each boy a package, something to remember this night by. The packages were heavier than they looked, and they seemed to pulse with warmth against their palms. Zeke wanted to put his down, wanted to run from this house, and never look back. But his fingers seemed to have developed a will of their own. "What is it?" Marcus asked. "A gift," Van Court replied. "Something that will help you see things as they really are." Zeke finally found his voice. "We should go. Our parents are expecting us." "Of course they are." Van Court's smile never wavered. "But perhaps you could stay just a few minutes longer. I so rarely have visitors, especially young ones with such potential." The word potential seemed to hang in the air like smoke from the candles. Zeke felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. "No," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "We need to leave. Now." For just a moment, something flickered across Van Court's face, something that might have been disappointment or might have been anger. But the smile returned so quickly that Zeke wondered if he had imagined it. "Of course," the old man said. "How thoughtless of me. Young gentlemen such as yourselves have obligations to meet." He walked them to the door, his footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floors. As they stepped back onto the porch, he called after them, "Do take care of those gifts. They are quite special." The boys hurried down the walkway and through the rusted gate, not speaking until they were well down the street. Only then did Zeke realize he was still clutching the silk-wrapped package. "That was weird," Marcus said, stating the obvious. "Yeah." Zeke looked back at the house, which seemed to loom larger in the darkness. The single candle still flickered in the front window, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw a figure watching them from behind the glass. They made their way back across the highway and into the familiar territory of the suburban development. Here, porch lights blazed cheerfully and the sounds of normal Halloween celebration filled the air. Children laughing, parents calling out reminders about curfews, the distant sound of a horror movie playing on someone's television. "I wonder what's in these," Marcus said, holding up his package. "I don't want to know," Zeke replied. Something about the gift made his skin crawl, but he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. They parted ways at the corner of Elm and 3rd, the same spot where they had met 2 hours earlier. Marcus headed toward his house on Birch Street, while Zeke turned toward Maple. Both boys were already 15 minutes past their curfews, but neither seemed to care about the inevitable parental lectures awaiting them. Zeke walked slowly toward his house, in no hurry to face his mother's worried questions and his father's disappointed frown. The silk package seemed to grow heavier with each step, and by the time he reached his front yard, it felt like it was burning against his palm. The lights were on in every window of 2047 Maple Street, and he could see his parents moving around inside his mother in the kitchen, probably making his favorite hot chocolate as a peace offering, his father pacing the living room with the controlled anxiety that came from years of corporate stress management. Zeke paused at the front gate, looking up at the house that had been his entire world for 12 years. Tomorrow he would be in trouble for staying out late. Next week he would have forgotten most of the details of his adventure on Blackwood Avenue. Next month, the silk package would be buried somewhere in his closet, beneath old toys and outgrown clothes. But tonight, standing in the cool October air, with the mysterious gift burning against his palm, Zeke Thorne felt like he was balanced on the edge of something vast and unknowable. He felt older somehow, as if his brief encounter with Eldridge Vancourt had aged him in ways he couldn't yet understand. He walked up the front path, fishing his key from his pocket with his free hand. Behind him, the wind picked up, rustling through the dying leaves and carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something that reminded him of old wood and leather, and that sweet, cloying smell from the Victorian house. As he reached for the front door, a sound made him turn around. Down the street, barely visible in the pale glow of the streetlights, a figure stood watching him, tall and gaunt, dressed in black, completely motionless. Zeke blinked, and the figure was gone. He fumbled with his key, suddenly desperate to get inside, to surround himself with the warmth and normalcy of his family home. The door opened just as his mother appeared in the hallway, her face a mixture of relief and impending lecture. "Ezekiel James Thorne, do you have any idea how worried?" She stopped mid-sentence, her expression changing as she looked at her son. Something in his face, perhaps, or the way he stood there clutching the silk package like a lifeline. "Honey, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," he said, but his voice sounded strange even to his own ears. "Just tired." Cordelia studied him for a moment longer, then stepped aside to let him in. "Your father's in the living room. He wants to talk to you about being responsible and keeping your word." Zeke nodded and headed toward the living room. But as he passed the front window, he couldn't help glancing back toward the street. It was empty now, lit only by the flickering streetlight and the glow from neighboring houses. But somehow he knew he was still being watched. In the living room, Brighton Thorne looked up from his newspaper with the expression of a man preparing to deliver a well-rehearsed lecture on responsibility and consequences. But like his wife, he paused when he saw his son's face. "Everything okay, buddy?" "Yeah, Dad. I'm sorry I'm late. We just got carried away with trick-or-treating." Brighton studied his son for a moment, then set aside his newspaper. "Well, your mother made hot chocolate. Why don't you get changed out of that costume and come tell us about your night?" Zeke nodded and headed upstairs to his room, still clutching the silk package. As he climbed the stairs, he could hear his parents whispering in the living room, the kind of concerned parental consultation that usually preceded increased supervision and reduced privileges. In his room, Zeke finally allowed himself to really look at the package Vancourt had given him. The silk was deep purple, almost black, and the ribbon was tied in an intricate knot that seemed to shift and change as he looked at it. The weight was all wrong for something so small it felt dense and warm, as if it contained something alive. He set it on his desk and stepped back, suddenly afraid to touch it again. Whatever was inside, he was certain, it wasn't candy or money or any kind of normal Halloween treat. It was something else. Something that made his skin crawl and his stomach turn. But even as he told himself he should throw it away, should ask his parents what to do, should do anything except keep it, Zeke found himself drawn to the mysterious gift. There was something about it that called to him, something that whispered promises of secrets and knowledge, and power beyond his 12-year-old understanding. He was still staring at it when his mother called him down for hot chocolate and the inevitable conversation about responsibility and safety. He went downstairs and submitted to his parents' gentle interrogation, answering their questions about where he had gone and what he had done with the automatic responses of a child who had learned to reveal just enough truth to satisfy adult curiosity without inviting deeper investigation. Later that night, as he lay in bed listening to the wind outside his window, Zeke thought about the old man and the dark house and the photograph of children with wrong faces. He thought about the figure he had seen or imagined watching him from the street. Most of all, he thought about the package sitting on his desk, pulsing with its own inner warmth like a sleeping heart. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the faint sound of sirens, ambulance, or police. He couldn't tell which. The sound seemed to go on for a long time, growing closer and then fading away into the night. He wondered idly what emergency was unfolding somewhere else in Millbrook Falls. What tragedy was touching some other family while he lay safe in his warm bed. He had no way of knowing that the sirens were for Marcus Holloway, who had never made it home that night, who had vanished somewhere between the corner of Elm and 3rd and his front door on Birch Street, leaving behind only a silk package and a set of footprints that stopped abruptly in the middle of the sidewalk, as if he had simply stepped out of existence. Zeke wouldn't learn about Marcus's disappearance until the next morning, when his mother woke him with tears in her eyes and hands that shook as she tried to explain that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and that the police were looking for his best friend, and that everything was going to be all right even though nothing would ever be all right again. But for now, in the last hours of his innocence, Zeke Thorne drifted off to sleep while the mysterious package pulsed on his desk, and the wind outside his window carried whispers of a darkness that had only just begun to unfold. November 6:42 a.m. Clear skies. The morning after Halloween arrived with the cruel clarity that often follows tragedy. Sunlight streamed through Zeke's bedroom window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. For a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and waking, everything was normal. The silk package on his desk was just a Halloween treat. Marcus was probably still asleep in his own bed, dreaming of candy and adventure. Then Cordelia's voice shattered the illusion. "Zeke, honey, I need you to come downstairs." There was something in her tone, a careful control that spoke of barely contained panic. Right now, he found his parents in the kitchen, still in their bathrobes, hovering over the phone like vultures around carrion. His father's face was ashen, while his mother's eyes were red-rimmed and bright with unshed tears. "What's wrong?" Zeke asked, though some primitive part of his brain already knew. Brighton cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncertain. "Son, Marcus didn't make it home last night. The police are looking for him." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. He sank into one of the kitchen chairs, his legs suddenly unable to support his weight. "What do you mean he didn't make it home?" "Mrs. Holloway called this morning," Cordelia said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "Marcus never came home last night. She waited up until midnight, then called the police. But I saw him," Zeke protested. "We said goodbye at the corner. He was going straight home." His father leaned forward, his corporate demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable. "Zeke, I need you to think very carefully. Did anything unusual happen last night? Did you see anyone or anything strange?" The image of Eldridge Vancourt's too white smile flashed through Zeke's mind, followed immediately by the memory of the figure watching him from the street. But how could he explain that without sounding like he was making up stories? How could he tell them about the old man and the silk package and the feeling that something fundamental had changed in the world? "We went to some houses on Blackwood Avenue," he said finally. "There was this old man, Mr. Vancourt. He gave us presents." Brighton and Cordelia exchanged glances. "What kind of presents?" his mother asked. Zeke's gaze drifted upward, toward his bedroom, where the package waited on his desk. Just Halloween stuff, wrapped in silk. Before his parents could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, Zeke could see the distinctive shape of a police car parked at the curb. His stomach dropped as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a case of Marcus being late or forgetting to call home. This was serious. Detective Ray Castellanos was a compact man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much of humanity's darker impulses. He sat across from Zeke in the living room, his notebook balanced on his knee, asking questions in a voice that was both gentle and relentless. "Tell me about this house on Blackwood Avenue," he said. "What was the address?" 1847, Zeke replied. "It was old and creepy. The man who lived there was named Van Court." Castellanos wrote something in his notebook, then looked up. "Can you describe him?" Zeke did his best to capture the old man's appearance. The silver hair, the pale skin, the anachronistic clothing. As he spoke, he noticed his parents exchanging worried glances with the detective. "And he gave you gifts?" Castellanos prompted. "Yes, wrapped in silk, purple silk." "Where is your gift now?" "Upstairs, in my room." The detective's eyes sharpened. "I'd like to see it, if that's okay with your parents." They all trooped upstairs to Zeke's bedroom. The package sat exactly where he had left it, though it seemed somehow different in the morning light, smaller perhaps, or less ominous. But when Detective Castellanos reached for it, Zeke felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to stop him. "Don't," he said, then felt foolish when everyone turned to look at him. "I mean, I haven't opened it yet. What if it's something private?" Castellanos paused, his hand hovering over the package. "Son, your friend is missing. Anything that might help us find him is important. Do you understand?" Zeke nodded reluctantly and watched as the detective carefully picked up the silk-wrapped bundle. The moment Castellanos touched it, his expression changed. A flicker of something, confusion perhaps, or unease crossed his weathered features. "It's warm," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. He untied the black ribbon with careful fingers, unwrapping the silk to reveal what lay within. For a moment, nobody spoke. They all stared at the object in Castellanos's palm, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. It was a candle. Not just any candle, but one that seemed to have been crafted by an artisan from another century. It was made of what looked like black wax, twisted into an intricate spiral that hurt to look at directly. Embedded in the wax were what appeared to be small bones, bird bones perhaps, or those of some other tiny creature. The wick was an unusual golden color, and it gave off a faint sweet scent that made Zeke's stomach turn. "What the hell?" Brighton muttered, then immediately apologized for his language. Castellanos wrapped the candle back in its silk covering, handling it like something that might bite. "I'm going to need to take this as evidence," he said. "And I think we need to pay a visit to this Mr. Van Court." An hour later, Detective Castellanos sat in his patrol car outside 1847 Blackwood Avenue, staring at an empty lot overgrown with weeds and brambles. According to city records, the Victorian mansion that Zeke had described so vividly had been demolished in The lot had been empty ever since, deemed unsuitable for development due to what the reports vaguely described as soil contamination issues. He called the station on his radio, requesting backup and a record search on anyone named Van Court associated with the property. While he waited, he walked the perimeter of the lot, looking for any sign that someone might be living there, a homeless encampment perhaps, or some kind of temporary structure that a 12-year-old boy might mistake for a house in the dark. He found nothing but dead grass and the crumbling foundation stones of the long-demolished mansion. Back at the station, the record search yielded results that made Castellanos reach for his second cup of coffee before 10 a.m. The house at 1847 Blackwood Avenue had indeed been owned by a man named Van Court Eldridge. Van Court, born in 1923, died. The death certificate listed the cause as natural causes, but the circumstances had been unusual enough to warrant a police investigation. Van Court had been found in his home on Halloween night, 1987, sitting in his front parlor with a single candle burning on the table beside him. He appeared to have died peacefully, but there were several odd details that had troubled the investigating officers. The house had been locked from the inside, with no sign of forced entry. The single candle had apparently been burning for hours, yet the wax showed no signs of melting. Most puzzling of all, Vancourt's body had been completely desiccated, as if all the moisture had been drained from it. The house had been demolished shortly after Vancourt's death, reportedly due to structural issues that made it unsafe for habitation. But according to the demolition crew's foreman, who was still alive and living in a nursing home across town, the real reason for the hasty destruction had been something else entirely. That place was wrong, the old man told Castellanos when he visited that afternoon. I have been in construction for 50 years, and I have never felt anything like what I felt in that house. It was like the walls were watching you. My crew refused to work there after the first day. We had to bring in a team from Portland to finish the job. What happened to Vancourt's possessions? Castellanos asked. Burned, the foreman replied without hesitation. All of it. The city council ordered everything in that house to be incinerated. Said it was a health hazard, but I think they were just as spooked as we were. Meanwhile, the search for Marcus Holloway was expanding across Millbrook Falls. Volunteers combed through the woods that bordered the town, checked abandoned buildings, and knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen a 12-year-old boy in a werewolf costume. The state police were called in, bringing search dogs and helicopters. The FBI was notified, though they had not yet taken over the case. Marcus's parents, Donald and Elena Holloway, held a press conference on the steps of the town hall. Elena broke down halfway through her prepared statement, her words dissolving into sobs as she begged anyone with information to come forward. Donald stood beside her, his jaw clenched and his eyes haunted, looking like a man who had aged a decade overnight. The media descended on Millbrook Falls like locusts, turning the quiet suburban community into a three-ring circus of news vans and reporters. They interviewed neighbors, classmates, teachers, anyone who might have known Marcus or had insight into his disappearance. The story had all the elements that captured public attention. A missing child, Halloween night, a mysterious stranger. But for all the attention and resources focused on finding Marcus Holloway, there were no leads. No witnesses had seen him after he left Zeke at the corner. No security cameras had captured his image. It was as if he had simply walked into the night and vanished. Zeke found himself at the center of the investigation, the last person to have seen his friend alive. He was interviewed repeatedly by Detective Castellanos, child psychologists, and FBI agents. They asked the same questions over and over, probing for details he might have forgotten or overlooked. The story of the house on Blackwood Avenue and the mysterious Mr. Vancourt became a focal point of the investigation, even though the physical evidence suggested it was impossible. Teams of investigators combed through the empty lot, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs, searching for any sign of recent activity. They found nothing. The candle that had been hidden in the silk package was sent to the state crime lab for analysis. The results were as puzzling as everything else connected to the case. The wax was indeed made from a material they couldn't identify, something that appeared to be organic, but didn't match any known substance in their database. The small bones embedded in it were from various species of birds, some of which had been extinct for decades. Most disturbing of all, the candle seemed to emit a faint electromagnetic field that interfered with nearby electronic equipment. Digital cameras malfunctioned when pointed at it. Recording devices produced nothing but static. Even the lab spectrometer gave inconsistent readings, as if the candle existed partially outside the realm of normal physics. As November wore on and the search for Marcus continued to yield no results, the investigation began to take a toll on everyone involved. Detective Castellanos found himself waking up in the middle of the night, thinking about the empty lot and the impossible house and the boy who had vanished without a trace. The case files filled 3 boxes, but they contained more questions than answers. For Zeke, the weeks following Marcus's disappearance were a blur of interviews, therapy sessions, and the suffocating attention of adults who spoke in hushed tones whenever he entered a room. He stopped sleeping through the night, jolting awake at the slightest sound, convinced that he could hear Marcus calling his name from the darkness outside his window. His parents enrolled him in counseling with Dr. Sarah Hutchinson, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma. She had kind eyes and a gentle voice, but Zeke could see the skepticism behind her professional demeanor whenever he talked about the house on Blackwood Avenue. "Sometimes when we experience trauma," she explained during one of their sessions, "our minds create false memories to help us cope with feelings of guilt or helplessness. It's a normal psychological defense mechanism." "I didn't make it up," Zeke insisted. "The house was real. Mr. Vancourt was real." "I believe that you believe that," Dr. Hutchinson replied carefully. "But the evidence suggests that something else happened that night, something your mind is protecting you from remembering." But Zeke knew what he had seen, what he had experienced. The house had been real, even if it shouldn't have existed. Vancourt had been real, even if he had been dead for 26 years. And somewhere in the mystery of that impossible encounter lay the key to what had happened to Marcus. The breakthrough came in early December, when a maintenance worker at the town cemetery made a disturbing discovery. While cleaning up fallen leaves around the older section of Millbrook Falls Memorial Gardens, he noticed that one of the headstones had been disturbed. The ground around it was loose and freshly turned, as if someone had been digging. The headstone belonged to Eldridge Vancourt. Detective Castellanos arrived at the cemetery within an hour of receiving the call. The groundskeeper led him to the old section, where Victorian-era monuments stood like silent sentinels among the bare oak trees. Vancourt's grave was modest compared to some of the elaborate memorials nearby, just a simple granite headstone, with his name, dates, and a single line of text. "The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long." The earth around the grave had definitely been disturbed, but not in the way Castellanos had expected. Instead of being dug up from the outside, it looked as if something had pushed up from within. The soil was scattered in a rough circle around the headstone, and there were what appeared to be claw marks scratched into the granite. But when they opened the grave, they found Vancourt's coffin exactly as it should have been, sealed and undisturbed, containing nothing but bones and rotting fabric. The mystery deepened when the cemetery's records revealed that Vancourt's burial had been unusual in several respects. He had been interred with a number of personal possessions, despite the fact that such practices had been discouraged for decades. The burial manifest listed books, candles, and what were described as ritual implements. More troubling still was the discovery that Vancourt's will had contained a very specific provision. Every Halloween night, a single candle was to be lit on his grave and allowed to burn until dawn. The cemetery had faithfully carried out this request for 26 years, funded by a trust that Vancourt had established before his death. The groundskeeper confirmed that he had lit the customary candle on Halloween night, just as he had every year since Vancourt's burial. But when he came to check on it, the next morning, the morning Marcus was discovered missing, the candle was gone. As December turned to January, and the search for Marcus Holloway continued without success, the case began to fade from the headlines. The FBI scaled back their involvement. The volunteer search parties dwindled. Life in Millbrook Falls slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the shadow of the missing boy hung over the community like a permanent cloud. For the Holloway family, there was no return to normalcy. Elena took a leave of absence from her job at the library and spent her days driving the streets of Millbrook Falls, looking for some sign of her missing son. Donald threw himself into his work with the desperate intensity of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts. At 2047 Maple Street, the Thorne family struggled with their own demons. Zeke's grades plummeted. He stopped participating in his usual activities, withdrew from his friends, and spent most of his free time in his room, staring at the empty desk where the candle had once sat. Brighton and Cordelia tried everything they could think of to help their son cope with the trauma of losing his best friend. They increased his therapy sessions, encouraged him to join new clubs, even considered moving to a different town for a fresh start. But nothing seemed to reach him. The truth was that Zeke was haunted by more than just guilt and grief. He was haunted by the certainty that he had been chosen for something, that his encounter with Vancourt had marked him in ways he couldn't understand. Sometimes late at night he would swear he could smell that sweet, cloying scent that had filled the Victorian mansion. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't have been there. And sometimes, on nights when the wind was just right and the house was perfectly quiet, he could swear he heard Marcus calling his name. The candle was gone, taken as evidence, and locked away in a climate-controlled storage facility. But Zeke could still feel its presence, as if some invisible thread connected him to that twisted piece of black wax and embedded bone. He knew, with the absolute certainty that only children possess, that this was not over. Somewhere in the darkness that had swallowed his best friend, something was waiting. Something that had been waiting far longer than the 26 years since Eldridge Vancourt's death. Something that had marked him that Halloween night and would not be satisfied until it collected what it was owed. As winter settled over Millbrook Falls, and the investigation into Marcus Holloway's disappearance officially moved to the cold case files, Zeke Thorne began the long process of learning to live with the knowledge that monsters were real, that they walked among the living, and that sometimes they took the people you loved most. He had no way of knowing that in exactly 10 years, on another Halloween night, the debt would come due. 7:45 p.m. Overcast. 22-year-old Ezekiel Thorne stood in the evidence room of the Millbrook Falls Police Department, staring at a cardboard box that had haunted his dreams for a decade. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor, while Detective Ray Castellanos, grayer now, more weathered but still carrying the weight of unsolved cases in his tired eyes, watched him with barely concealed concern. "You sure about this, son?" Castellanos asked for the third time. "It's been 10 years. Maybe it's time to let sleeping dogs lie." Zeke's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the box. Inside, wrapped in the same purple silk that had first caught his attention as a 12-year-old boy, lay the candle that had started it all. The twisted black wax seemed to pulse with its own inner darkness, and the small bones embedded within it gleamed like tiny stars in the harsh light. "I have to know," Zeke said, his voice hoarse from a decade of nightmares and unanswered questions. "Marcus deserves that much." The intervening years had not been kind to Zeke Thorne. The trauma of losing his best friend had followed him through high school, where he'd been known as the kid whose friend disappeared. College had been a brief escape, but even there, surrounded by new faces and new experiences, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to collect what it was owed. He'd dropped out during his sophomore year at Portland State, unable to concentrate on anything except the growing certainty that Halloween 2023 would bring answers one way or another. His parents had begged him to continue therapy, to try medication, to do anything except return to Millbrook Falls and dig up the past. But Zeke knew that running wouldn't solve anything. The debt was his, and it would follow him wherever he went. The past month had been a blur of research and preparation. He'd studied everything he could find about Eldridge Vancourt, about the house that had once stood at 1847 Blackwood Avenue, about the occult practices that seemed to swirl around the old man like smoke around a flame. What he'd discovered had chilled him to the bone. Vancourt hadn't been just an eccentric recluse. He'd been part of something much darker, a practitioner of what historical records euphemistically called alternative spiritual practices. The truth was far more sinister. Vancourt had been a soul collector, someone who traded in the currency of human life force, extending his own existence by binding others to his will. The candles were the key. Each one was crafted from materials that bridged the gap between the physical and spiritual worlds. Black wax infused with grave dirt, wicks spun from the hair of the dead, bones from creatures that had died in terror. They were designed to create a connection between the giver and receiver, a psychic tether that could be activated when the time was right. The lab boys never could figure out what that thing was made of. Castellano said, nodding toward the candle. Played hell with their equipment. Still does, from what I hear. Zeke lifted the candle from its silk wrapping, feeling the familiar warmth that seemed to radiate from within the twisted wax. The moment his skin made contact with it, the world shifted slightly, as if reality had slipped a gear. Zeke, Marcus's voice whispered through the evidence room, so faint it might have been the wind outside. Zeke, I have been waiting. Castellanos's eyes widened. Did you hear that? You heard it too? Zeke's heart hammered against his ribs. For 10 years he'd wondered if the voices were real or just products of his traumatized mind. Having confirmation that others could hear them was both terrifying and strangely relieving. Clear as day, the detective whispered. Son, maybe we should... Zeke, please. Marcus's voice was stronger now, seeming to come from the candle itself. I have been trapped for so long. He won't let me go. Won't let any of us go. The temperature in the evidence room dropped 10 degrees in as many seconds. Their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the metal shelving units that lined the walls. Any of you? Zeke asked, addressing the candle directly. Marcus, how many others are there? So many, came the reply. And now there were other voices joining Marcus's children's voices, young and frightened and lost. He's been collecting us for decades, for centuries. Every Halloween, when the veil is thinnest, he takes another one. Castellanos was backing toward the door, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. This is impossible. Dead men don't talk, and missing kids. He's not dead, Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the detective's protests like a blade through silk. None of us are dead. We are trapped, bound to him by the candles, by the gifts we accepted. Our souls are his to command, our life force feeding his eternal existence. The candle in Zeke's hands was growing warmer, the wax beginning to soften despite the plummeting temperature in the room. The embedded bones were glowing now, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls like imprisoned spirits. But you escaped, Zeke said. That night, you made it home. You never lit your candle. I tried to. Marcus's voice was filled with regret. I was going to light it as soon as I got to my room. But something stopped me. Some last bit of intuition told me not to. I threw it away instead, tossed it in the storm drain on Birch Street. Then how? Because you kept yours. The voice that answered wasn't Marcus's. It was older, cultured, tinged with an accent from another era. Eldridge Van Court spoke through the candle with the same aristocratic diction Zeke remembered from that Halloween night 10 years ago. The connection was already established, young Ezekiel. Your friend's rejection of my gift simply meant that his collection would be delayed. The evidence room filled with shadows that had no earthly source. They poured from the corners like liquid darkness, pooling around their feet and climbing the walls with impossible grace. Within the shadows, Zeke could see shapes, dozens of them, the silhouettes of children from across the decades, all trapped in Van Court's web of supernatural bondage. You are supposed to be dead, Castellanos managed, his voice cracking with the strain of accepting what he was witnessing. Van Court's laughter echoed through the room like the rustle of autumn leaves. Death is such a limiting concept, detective. I prefer to think of myself as evolved. These children, you see, they provide me with the energy I need to maintain my existence between worlds. Their youth, their vitality, their pure life force, it sustains me far better than any earthly form ever could. Let them go, Zeke demanded, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. You want me? Fine, but let the others go. Oh, my dear boy, you misunderstand the situation entirely. Van Court's amusement was palpable. I already have you. The moment you accepted my gift, you became mine. The 10-year delay was simply seasoning. Adult souls are so much more complex, so much more nourishing than those of children. The candle in Zeke's hands was burning now, though he hadn't lit it. The golden wick had somehow ignited itself, producing a flame that burned black instead of orange. The shadows in the room grew deeper, more substantial, and he could feel his strength beginning to ebb, as if something was drawing the life force from his very bones. "But I have a proposition for you," Vancourt continued. "A game, if you will. Light the candle fully, embrace your destiny as my servant, and I will release one of the others. Your friend, Marcus, perhaps. Would that not be a fair trade?" "Don't do it," Marcus's voice pleaded. "He's lying. He can't release us. The binding is permanent. Once you are taken, you are his forever." Zeke looked at the candle burning in his hands, at the shadows that were slowly solidifying into the forms of lost children, at Detective Castellanos, who stood frozen by the door with terror and disbelief warring in his eyes. 10 years of guilt and grief and sleepless nights had led to this moment. 10 years of wondering what had happened to his best friend, of living with the knowledge that he had somehow been spared while Marcus had been taken. But as he stared into the black flame, a memory surfaced, something Dr. Hutchinson had told him during one of their therapy sessions. Something about the power of choice and personal agency even in the darkest circumstances. "You made one mistake, Vancourt," Zeke said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You assumed I'd be alone." He pulled his cell phone from his pocket with his free hand, speed dialing a number he'd memorized but hoped never to use. It was answered on the first ring. "Father Miguel Restrepo," came the voice on the other end. "You said to call if the situation escalated." "It's time," Zeke said simply. The priest had been his last-ditch plan, discovered during his months of research into Vancourt's background. Father Restrepo was an exorcist, one of the few sanctioned by the Catholic Church to deal with cases of supernatural oppression. More importantly, he was one of the investigators who had looked into the strange circumstances surrounding Vancourt's death in "I'm in the parking lot," the priest replied. "Keep him talking for 30 more seconds." Vancourt's shadows writhed with sudden agitation. "What have you done?" "What I should have done 10 years ago," Zeke replied. "I got help." The evidence room door burst open, and Father Restrepo strode in carrying a leather satchel and wearing the purple stole of his office. He was a man in his 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen the worst humanity had to offer. But there was no fear in his face, only grim determination. "Eldridge Vancourt," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute faith. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, I command you to release these souls." The shadows recoiled as if struck by a physical blow. Vancourt's laughter turned to something closer to a snarl. "You have no power here, priest. These children came to me willingly. They accepted my gifts." "Children cannot consent to their own damnation," Father Restrepo replied, pulling a vial of holy water from his satchel. "And free will corrupted by supernatural manipulation is no free will at all." He began to chant in Latin, his voice rolling through the evidence room like thunder. The shadows writhed and twisted, trying to escape the words that seemed to cut through them like swords of light. The temperature in the room began to rise, and the frost on the shelving started to melt. But Vancourt wasn't finished. The candle in Zeke's hands flared brighter, its black flame reaching toward the ceiling. "If I cannot have you willingly, boy, then I will take you by force." The shadows surged forward like a tidal wave of darkness, reaching for Zeke with grasping tendrils that felt like ice against his skin. He could feel his life force being drawn out of him, could see his reflection in the metal shelving growing pale and gaunt. It was Marcus who saved him. "Zeke, the flame!" his friend's voice shouted. "You have to blow out the flame." Such a simple solution. Such an obvious answer that Zeke's terrified mind had overlooked it entirely. He took a deep breath and blew as hard as he could, extinguishing the black flame in a single puff. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The shadows exploded outward like shattered glass, filling the air with the sound of screaming wind and breaking chains. The children trapped within them became visible for just a moment. Dozens of young faces, boys and girls from across the decades, all looking toward Zeke with expressions of profound gratitude before fading into points of light that rose toward the ceiling and vanished. Vancourt's scream of rage and defeat seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound that spoke of centuries of accumulated evil finally being undone. The candle in Zeke's hands crumbled to dust, the black wax disintegrating and the embedded bones turning to powder that sifted through his fingers like sand. And then, suddenly, it was over. The evidence room was just an evidence room again, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, concrete floor cold beneath their feet, metal shelving lined with cardboard boxes full of forgotten crimes. The only sign that anything supernatural had occurred was the lingering scent of sulfur and the fact that every electronic device in the building had shorted out simultaneously. "Marcus," Zeke called softly, but there was no answer. The connection was broken, the tether severed. His friend was finally free. Detective Castellanos slumped against the wall, his face pale and his hands shaking. "In 30 years of police work," he said quietly, "I have never seen anything like that." Father Restrepo was packing his satchel with practiced efficiency. "The church will want a full report," he said. "But officially this never happened. There are some mysteries that the world isn't ready to accept." Zeke nodded, understanding. He looked down at his hands, now empty except for a few grains of black dust. "Is it really over?" "For you, yes," the priest replied. Vancourt's power was tied to those candles, to the connections he forged with his victims. With the candle destroyed and his hold broken, he can no longer influence this world. The children are free, and you are safe. As they left the police station, stepping out into the crisp October night, Zeke felt something he hadn't experienced in 10 years' peace. The weight that had pressed down on him since that Halloween night when he was 12 had finally lifted. The voices that had whispered to him in the dark were silent at last. The town of Millbrook Falls slept peacefully around them, unaware that an ancient evil had just been banished from their midst. Halloween decorations flickered in windows, jack-o'-lanterns grinned from porches, and somewhere in the distance, children laughed as they made their way from house to house, collecting candy and creating memories that would last a lifetime. Zeke walked slowly toward his car, parked under a streetlight that cast a pool of warm yellow light on the wet asphalt. As he reached for the door handle, he heard something that made his heart skip a beat. "Thank you." He turned, expecting to see someone behind him, but the street was empty. Then he realized the voice hadn't come from outside it, had come from within, from some deep place in his soul where his best friend's gratitude would live forever. "You are welcome, Marcus," he whispered to the night. "Rest in peace." As he drove home through the familiar streets of his childhood, Zeke thought about the future for the first time in a decade. He would go back to school, finish his degree, maybe become a teacher or a counselor, someone who could help other kids navigate the darker corners of growing up. He would honor Marcus's memory not by dwelling in the past, but by building something meaningful from the pain they had both endured. The house at 2047 Maple Street was dark when he pulled into the driveway, his parents having long since given up waiting for him to come home at reasonable hours. But as he walked up the front path, the same path he had walked 10 years ago as a 12-year-old vampire with plastic fangs and a homemade cape, he could see a single candle burning in the front window. Not a black candle twisted with malevolent intent, but a simple white votive that his mother always lit on difficult anniversaries. It was her way of remembering Marcus, of honoring the friend her son had lost, and the innocence they had all sacrificed in the search for answers. Zeke paused at the front door, keys in hand, and made a silent promise to the memory of his best friend and to all the other children who had been trapped in Vancourt's web of darkness. He would live his life fully, joyously, without the shadow of guilt and fear that had haunted him for so long. He would make every day count, not just for himself, but for all those who had been denied the chance to grow up, to fall in love, to chase their dreams. The candle in the window flickered once, as if in acknowledgement, and then burned steady and bright, a beacon of hope in the darkness, a testament to the power of love and friendship to transcend even death itself. As Zeke Thorne stepped across the threshold of his childhood home and into the rest of his life, the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, marking the end of Halloween and the beginning of November. Somewhere in the distance, church bells tolled the hour, their bronze voices carrying across the sleeping town like prayers made audible. The mystery that had haunted Millbrook Falls for 10 years was finally solved. The missing boy had been found, not in any earthly sense, but in the way that mattered most. His soul was free, his spirit at peace, and his memory would live on in the heart of the friend who had never stopped looking for him. And in the evidence room of the Millbrook Falls Police Department, a cardboard box sat empty on a metal shelf, waiting to be filed away with all the other cases that defied explanation. The official report would list the Marcus Holloway investigation as closed due to lack of evidence. But Detective Ray Castellanos would know the truth, and Father Miguel Restrepo would add another entry to the church's most carefully guarded archives. Some mysteries, after all, were meant to be solved not by earthly justice, but by forces far more ancient and powerful than anything found in the natural world. And sometimes, just sometimes, love was stronger than death, friendship more enduring than evil, and the light of a single candle was enough to banish even the deepest darkness. The Halloween when a boy went missing without a trace had finally come to an end. The Halloween when a candle spoke back had become the night when all the lost souls found their way home.